of international law in general. All states should respect this principle since it is essential for peaceful cooperation and coexistence between the members of the international community. In order to de-escalate this tension, it is indispensable to restore confidence between all of the parties involved. This calls for firm political will from all parties. We therefore welcome the diplomatic initiatives which began last Sunday based on the proposal of holding meetings at the highest level. This is the only way out, the only solution to this situation. Confrontation is a war which everybody loses even before it has begun. It leaves behind a bitter aftertaste. And so once again, we call on all parties to become aware of the gravity of the escalation of these antagonistic positions and to take every measure possible to de-escalate tension and to return to diplomatic negotiations in order to reach a peaceful solution on the borders between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. Thank you very much, sir.
I thank the distinguished representative of Uruguay and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, the government of Peru, like the entire international community, notes with deep concern the development of events within the regions of Donetsk and Lugansk in Ukraine, and also the events on the eastern border between Ukraine and Russia. The government of Peru fully agrees with the statement of the Secretary General of the United Nations in the sense that recognizing the independence of the separatist territories and the displacement and the movement, rather, of military forces within these territories are incompatible with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, and they are a violation of the territorial integrity and of the sovereignty of Ukraine. It is imperative that all hostilities and ceasefire violations in the area stop in accordance with the provisions of the Minsk agreements. It is imperative that the parties involved make every effort to de-escalate the conflict, reduce tension, initiate a process of détente, generate trust, and find the most appropriate measures for the opening of consultations and negotiations which will make it possible to achieve a negotiated solution in accordance with the provisions of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. Peru reaffirms its conviction that international peace and security, in accordance with the provisions of Article 1 of the Charter, contains the imperative obligations for all states to resolve conflicts and any situation which could affect international peace and security through peaceful means for the resolution of disputes by strictly applying the principles of respect for the obligations emanating from the treaties and other sources of international law, refraining from the use of force or the threat of the use of force, respect for sovereignty, respect for the territorial integrity of states, and the protection of the human rights of the populations. In the difficult, complex current situation, the government of Peru that believes that it is indispensable and urgent to use the means that diplomacy provides to ensure consultations and negotiations which will lead to a peaceful, sustainable solution, which will take into account the legitimate interests of the parties, with strict respect for the principles of the Charter and the standards of international law. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Peru. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Hungary.
Mr. President, Excellencies, dear colleagues, we align ourselves with the statement delivered by the European Union, and I wish to make the following remarks in our national capacity. Hungary reaffirms its unwavering support for Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty within its internationally recognized borders. We express our deep concern regarding the destabilizing security situation in and around eastern Ukraine. The UN Charter is clear. It unequivocally prohibits the use or the threat of force against the territorial integrity and political independence of states, and also demands for states to settle their international disputes by peaceful means. We emphasize, once again, the importance of fully respecting international law and international agreements, as well as basic principles enshrined not only in the UN Charter, but also in the Helsinki Final Act, the Paris Charter, and the Budapest Memorandum. There were, and there still are, multiple diplomatic tracks available and on the way that had and have the ability to offer peaceful and diplomatic solutions. Hungary, as a Central European country, is genuinely interested in East-West dialogue. Our region has always suffered as a consequence of conflict between the two sides. We have not forgotten the experience of the Cold War. Thus, a return to such practices must be avoided. Therefore, despite the dramatic escalation of tensions in eastern Ukraine, it remains in our interest to see that all relevant actors focusing their efforts on ensuring an immediate cessation of hostilities, protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, preventing any actions and statements that may further escalate the dangerous situation in and around Ukraine, and prioritize diplomacy to address all issues in a peaceful manner. We reaffirm our solidarity with the people of Ukraine and our support to Ukraine. Hungary recalls the support provided to Ukraine bilaterally in numerous forms, such as economic development assistance, a voluntary contribution of 100,000 euros and COVID-19 antigen test for the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission of Ukraine, 120 respirators to hospitals in Ukraine, COVID-19 related assistance amounting to approximately $12 million, medical treatment and rehabilitation for wounded Ukrainian soldiers, and camping for kids whose parents have been affected by the conflict in eastern Ukraine. Renovation of the crisis center in Kherson and an outpatient station in the village of Valuiske. Since the 1st of February 2022, the transfer of reverse flow gas to Ukraine from Hungary has begun, and as the most recent form of assistance. We continue to contribute in close coordination with Ukraine's authorities to the strengthening of Ukraine's resilience. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Hungary. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liberia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, pursuant to the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 68262, territorial integrity of Ukraine, and subsequent resolutions on the human rights situation in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, Ukraine, and the problem of the militarization of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, Ukraine, as well as parts of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. Mr. President, the Republic of Liberia maintains its position as articulated at the UN General Assembly in 2014 during the debate on Ukraine, at which time it urged Russia to defuse tensions and respect the rights of Ukraine. Liberia calls on Russia not to attack Ukraine. We further urge Russia to use diplomacy and dialogue to resolve its stated security concerns and to reverse Russia's military buildup along the borders of Ukraine and in occupied Crimea. Liberia hereby reaffirms its commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, since Ukraine currently poses no threat to Russia. Mr. President, in this 21st century, when our world body, the United Nations, is promoting peace and security, war is certainly not the answer. The path of dialogue and peace is most prudent. Therefore, adhering to the tenets of democracy is critical and should prevail so that the individual rights of nations are not infringed. The sovereignty of Ukraine must be respected. I thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Liberia, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ecuador.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, I will not confine my statement to the debate on agenda item 67 because of the tensions on the border between Ukraine and Russia. I will have to refer to international peace and security as a higher goal, which this meeting should contribute to. I closely followed the briefing of the Security Council last January 31st on the situation in the region under the topic Threats to International Peace and Security during the Norwegian presidency of the Security Council. I did the same during the briefing of the 17th of February and the open meeting of the 19th of February during the current presidency of the Russian Federation of the Security Council. I wish to stress that I find value in the statements of the members of the Security Council with no exception, as well as the statements of those who participated under Rules 37 and 39 of the Provisional Rules of Procedure of the Security Council. But the greater value is in continued dialogue and direct negotiations between the parties in order to overcome this escalation of tensions. based on the traditional vocation of peace that Ecuador has, I respectfully call for the states involved and the rest of the international community, including the many stakeholders, to avoid narratives that exacerbate tensions. This could make the difference between peace and conflict. In this vein, I reiterate to this General Assembly the full conviction of Ecuador for the defense of international law and the Charter of the United Nations, particularly Article 2. And I call on all parties to comply with their international obligations, including those contracted under the Minsk agreements. I am persuaded that the militarization of the areas and arming in these regions does not encourage a diplomatic exit. Lastly, I support the views of Secretary General Antonio Guterres. I thank him for the frankness of his words and express Ecuador's trust that if good faith and the will of the parties to make their best efforts, if this prevails, we will be able to achieve greater peace, not only for Europe, but for the entire world. Thank you for your kind attention.
Representative of Ecuador. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Slovakia.
Mr. President, my delegation fully aligns itself with the statement made by the distinguished representative of the European Union. Allow me to add some additional remarks in our national capacity. I would like to start by thanking you for convening this important debate on the situation in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, which we unfortunately consider very timely and urgent. I intentionally use the word unfortunately, as we are once again seeing a massive pressure on Ukrainian sovereignty. Slovakia fully rejects the decision by the Russian Federation to recognize the independence of separatist entities, the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. This decision is a blatant violation of international law, to say the least. In this regard, we would particularly like to welcome the statement of the Secretary General, who considers the decision of the Russian Federation to be a violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and inconsistent with the principles of the UN Charter. That UN Charter, which has recently celebrated its important anniversary, and we have all reaffirmed and reconfirmed our attention and our belief in its relevance and its validity. We have signed collectively the poster, which is actually displayed right next to where I'm standing, which reaffirms the important nature of this basic document. We have also recently celebrated one of the 14 experts that drafted the UN Charter, Dr. Jan Papanek, who used to be the first permanent representative of Czechoslovakia to the United Nations. With all that in mind, we have to express our serious concern about the situation that we find ourselves at. We also fully agree with the Secretary General that the UN Charter principles are not a la carte menu and cannot be applied selectively. This decision of the Russian Federation is a breach of its obligations according to the Budapest Memorandum and the Minsk agreements, to which the Russian Federation is a party and which remain the only basis for a settlement of the conflict in Donbas. This decision is likewise an unacceptable step in direct contradiction to the declared interest in seeking a constructive solution in diplomatic dialogue in relevant international formats as well as to the principle of indivisibility of security, which the Russian Federation itself emphasizes and calls for its respect by both NATO and the European Union. Slovakia firmly does not recognize the self-proclaimed independence of the separatist entities. We call on the Russian Federation to immediately stop fueling the conflict by providing financial and military support to separatists and to withdraw Russian troops and material from the sovereign territory of Ukraine. The principal position of Slovakia is based on unwavering support to the political sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of our neighbor, Ukraine, and universal validity and respect for the principles of international law. We do not recognize and continue to condemn the illegal annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation. Since the illegal annexation of Crimea, human rights situation in the peninsula has significantly deteriorated. We are particularly concerned that residents of the peninsula face systematic restrictions to their human rights, such as the freedoms of expression, religion or belief, and association, and the right to peaceful assembly. We likewise remain concerned over the increasing militarization of the Crimean Peninsula. I would also like to reconfirm our strong support to the Normandy format, the Trilateral Contact Group, and the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine in finding a peaceful political solution to the conflict in Donbas. After almost 8 years since the beginning of this crisis, we continue to emphasize that in order to achieve a lasting peace and resolution of the conflict, all sides need to engage constructively and in good faith. We urge the Russian Federation to return to the path of diplomacy and dialogue. Ukraine is Slovakia's friend and largest neighbor, and it is in our strategic, vital interest to have a stable, secure, and prosperous Ukraine. We seize this opportunity once again to reiterate our firm belief that it is in the interest of the whole international community as well. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Slovakia, and I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of Austria.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Austria fully aligns with the EU statement that we heard this morning. Permit me to add these short reflections in our national capacity. Mr. President, dear colleagues, this hall has seen its share of debates, all kinds of debates, on all kinds of issues. Today, as we heard in many interventions, this debate is about peace and war. It's about the fundamental purpose of this organization. We are here to discuss the extremely dangerous situation evolving in and around Ukraine due to Russia's illegal acts. So at the very outset, let me state the key message today for Austria. Austria confirms its unwavering support for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Over the last couple of weeks, we have witnessed a worrying escalation of a situation that Ukrainians have had to endure for years. This has to stop. We commend the Ukrainian side for its posture of restraint in the face of continued provocations and efforts of destabilization. As a neutral state, not party to any military alliance, Austria's security relies on the respect for international law. Austria, therefore, cannot stand by idly when a country's territorial integrity and political independence is under threat. We cannot accept that borders are moved through force in the 21st century. Austria considers international law, with the United Nations Charter at its core, as the indispensable basis for our international system and for international cooperation. This includes the core principles of peaceful settlement of disputes, as well as refraining from the threat or use of force. Every UN member state signed up to these principles. These principles keep us safe. The recognition of the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics by the Russian Federation represents a grave violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, which we condemn categorically. With this unilateral step, Russia violates international law and threatens to make the Minsk agreements aimed at peacefully solving the conflict in eastern Ukraine null and void. It is also contrary to UN Security Council Resolution 2202, which calls for full implementation of the Minsk agreements. Together with our partners in the EU and beyond, we call on Russia to de-escalate, reverse the military buildup, and abide by international law. It's not too late to change course, to engage constructively in dialogue through the established international mechanisms, such as the OSCE in Vienna, the Trilateral Contact Group, the Normandy format, and of course also the United Nations here in New York. Recently, and again this morning here in this room, UN Secretary General Guterres recalled the provisions of the United Nations Charter regarding the prohibition of the use of force and offered his good offices. We encourage all sides to take this offer seriously. Mr. President, let me be clear. This crisis is not only one of regional concern. It is of global concern. Violations of international law, including the UN Charter, don't only affect a few. They affect all member states of the United Nations. They are dangerous precedents that it can determine our future. If UN principles have any relevance, then non-use of force and sovereignty should protect each state from intervention by others. Territorial integrity should prevent other states annexing your territory. And political independence should give you the right to choose your own leaders and the right to determine your own security policy. Over the past weeks, we have been presented with arguments possibly seeking to justify violations of these principles. We are absolutely not convinced. At the Security Council on Monday, and probably some of you heard that, Kenya made a strong statement refuting arguments based on historic ties or past territorial possessions. Indeed, many UN member states have historically been parts or colonies of others. But does this give former possessors, former colonial empires, the right to dictate policies, to intervene, and even claim parts of their former territories? No, clearly it does not. Colleagues, take a moment and imagine. What if we were in Ukraine's shoes? And if we were in Ukraine's shoes, what would we expect from the international community? What would we expect from the United Nations, from this General Assembly here? The answer for Austria is clear. We would expect a clear condemnation of all violations of international law and a call on Russia to return to complying fully with our jointly agreed principles and commitments. Many speakers here today stressed that, all things considered, our job here at the UN is to prevent human suffering, avoid human tragedies, help make people feel safe and secure. We agree. And to achieve that, let me reiterate, abiding by international law is the best security policy for all. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Austria, and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Korea.
Mr. Vice President, my delegation expresses its grave concern over the recent escalation of tensions regarding Ukraine. We condemn any act that seriously undermines the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of any member state. In this regard, we are seriously concerned with Russia's decision to recognize the independence of certain areas of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. This undermines the fundamental principle of international law, including the UN Charter. Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity should be respected. We urge Russia to de-escalate the tensions and reverse its military buildup in the region. The Republic of Korea reaffirms its unwavering support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. In this vein, we are in line with the Secretary General's recent statements. All relevant international and bilateral agreements, including the 1994 Budapest Memorandum and the Minsk Agreement, as endorsed by Security Council Resolution 2202, must be fully observed. According to the UN Charter, all member states shall settle disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered. It also requires that all states refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. The Republic of Korea believes that where there is a political will, there is a peaceful political solution. We urge all concerned parties to seek ways to peacefully resolve the situation. The peace and stability of Ukraine is important not only to peace in Europe, but also beyond. The humanitarian impact of the current crisis is worrying. The Republic of Korea will triple its aid for Ukraine this year. We will stand by the efforts by the international community to address humanitarian needs in Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Republic of Korea. And I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Mr. President, the situation in and around Ukraine has escalated and become critical. Brazil is following the latest developments with deep concern. Geopolitical tensions and threats to international peace and security require the United Nations to engage promptly and timely. In present circumstances, the international community must express its steadfast commitment to promote political and diplomatic efforts to bring peaceful and lasting solution to this crisis. Our primary objective must be to prevent war. There is an urgent need to de-escalate tensions and resort to meaningful dialogue between the parties involved. We urge these parties to exercise maximum restraint and engage constructively in talks aimed at resolving their differences. we firmly believe that there is still room to restore confidence and find a negotiated and acceptable outcome. Brazil calls all parties to strictly observe international law. It is imperative to fully respect the principles enshrined in the Charter in a non-selective manner. The prohibition of the use of force, the peaceful resolution of disputes, and the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-intervention, and the protection of human rights are pillars of our collective security system. We believe that a permanent solution to the crisis in Ukraine must take into account the legitimate concerns of all parties within the framework of diplomatic talks and according to parameters established by relevant Security Council resolutions, such as Resolution 2202, and in the spirit of the Minsk agreements. We urge an immediate ceasefire with comprehensive disengagement of troops and military equipment on the ground. We believe that the military disengagement is key to build trust among the parties and to achieve a sustainable solution for the crisis. Mr. President, diplomatic means are not yet exhausted. We renew our plea to all concerned parties to keep the dialogue with openness, flexibility, and a sense of urgency to find ways for lasting peace in Ukraine and in the wider region. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Brazil. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belgium.
Mr. President, Belgium aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union. I should like, furthermore, to deliver a few remarks in my national capacity. Mr. President, I wish to reaffirm Belgium's full support for the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. What is at stake today is respect for the core principles which undergird this organization and the entire structure of the international rules-based order. Respect for territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence of states, and a prohibition of the use of force. This was expressed by the statement of the Secretary General, whose good offices Belgium supports. The decision of President Putin to recognize the independence of the separatist Ukrainian territories of Donetsk and Lugansk and to deploy troops to those areas flies in the face of this international rules-based order. This constitutes a breach of the Charter of the United Nations, the Helsinki Final Act, the Minsk Accords, which were endorsed by the Security Council in Resolution 2202, as well as a violation of the Budapest Memorandum. These actions by the Russian Federation cannot be left without a response from the European Union and allies. We should like to see sanctions that are both proportionate and targeted. It is in this spirit of respect for international law that Belgium has advocated for weeks for a diplomatic end to this crisis in respect for the agreements arrived at. We call upon Russia to respect international law, to respect commitments, and to reverse its decision recognizing independence of the separatist territories of Donetsk and Lugansk. Mr. President, we also wish to call for full respect for international humanitarian law, including with guarantees for safe, secure, unfettered humanitarian access and respect for human rights. With respect to Crimea, Belgium condemns the illegal annexation of the peninsula, which also constitutes an egregious violation of international law and the core principles of the international order. We remain firm in our position of non-recognition of this illegal annexation by the Russian Federation in line with the Resolution 68/262 adopted by the General Assembly. Mr. President, what is transpiring at present in Ukraine does not only concern Europeans. Every member state of this organization is concerned. Let us work together to ensure a rules-based order which constitutes the bedrock of our organization. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belgium. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia.
Señor Vicepresidente.
Mr. Vice President, my delegation joins all those who have expressed their concern at the increase in tension and the latest developments in Ukraine, which undermine the foundation of international order.